Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the state of Wisconsin and why I think Ron Johnson will win in November's midterm elections to a third term in the United States Senate. So that's a pretty bold prediction, especially given the fact that he is currently down in the polling average. But as we're going to see throughout this video, taking a look at previous Wisconsin elections, polling in Wisconsin, and the likely national environment we're expected to see this November, I think it's very evident that Ron Johnson is in a very strong position to win re-election by a couple of points. Now, before we begin, of course, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, if we take a look at the 2022 Wisconsin Senate race, currently Mandela Barnes, the current lieutenant governor, is up on Ron Johnson in the average by 1.7% according to Real Clear Politics. Now, if we take a look at the polling overall, Mandela Barnes really had the advantage in this race up until this point, and I think one of the reasons for that is polls tend to overestimate Democrats in the state of Wisconsin, and as we're going to see in some cases very dramatically. But Ron Johnson in the latest poll is leading, and I think that is a very good sign for him, given the fact that, one, this is a registered voters poll, which is very interesting, but number two, Republicans rarely ever lead in the polls in Wisconsin, even when they do win. So the fact that Ron Johnson is leading in the Marquette University poll, I think is very significant. I don't think it's likely to be an outlier, even if Mandela Barnes does end up leading in some of the other polls. I think it's going to be a very close race polling-wise, and I think ultimately that will indicate a relatively strong performance for Ron Johnson this November. If we take a look at Wisconsin in the 2020 election, it's a state that votes to the right of the nation now. This is the second presidential election in a row where Wisconsin has voted to the right of the nation. Donald Trump only lost the state of Wisconsin by 0.6%, despite Joe Biden winning the national popular vote by about 4.5%. And if we take a look at the 2016 election, Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin by 0.7%, despite Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote by 2.3%. And I think it's worthy to note that before this point, Wisconsin had not voted for a Republican since Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide in 1984. So I think this shift in Wisconsin is very significant, especially since historically this has been a very liberal state going all the way back to the 19th century. A lot of liberal labor movements arose in Wisconsin. Obviously, the rurals up until recently were fairly democratic, especially when compared to other states around the country. So overall, this is indicative of a trend that Wisconsin is moving in Republicans' favor. And I think in 2022, a year where Republicans are expected to do fairly well, they're expected at least to do better than in 2020, you would expect that Republicans would be able to pull off a victory in this Senate race. Now, going back to 2020 for a second, though, I want to take a look at the polls that we saw out of Wisconsin, because if we take a look at some of these averages, they really missed the mark. If we look at the 270 to win aggregate, Biden was up by 9.2%. Real Clear Politics had him up by 6.7%, and FiveThirtyEight had him up by 8.4%. Overall, that put Joe Biden at an 8-point advantage in the state of Wisconsin, and ultimately, he only ended up winning by less than 1. So he underperformed by nearly 7 points, despite the polls saying that he was going to do very well. This isn't something that's unique to Joe Biden or even unique to Donald Trump in terms of over or underperformance in the polls. We could take a look back at 2016 to the statewide opinion polling in Wisconsin, where Donald Trump was in a similarly poor position according to the polls. In some polls, he lost by as much as 12 points against a matchup with Hillary Clinton, and in some polls, he was only down by 2, and ultimately, he ended up winning the state by 0.7%. Now, if we take a look at Ron Johnson, we saw the exact same thing in 2016. The polls really missed the mark. You know, if you take yourself back to 2016, many people thought that Russ Feingold would be able to flip this seat blue, and Sabato's Crystal Ball and a number of other polling companies had this race as either lean or tilt D. A couple had it as toss-up, but really, if you take a look at the polls, there is a giant blue block going from 2013 all the way to October of 2016. That's how long Russ Feingold led in these polls. And in many cases, Russ Feingold was leading by 12 points, by 10 points, by pretty large margins in a swing state like Wisconsin. It really wasn't until a couple of weeks before the election that Ron Johnson started to lead in some of these polls, and even some of the polls that were taken before the election Russ Feingold had a huge advantage. Now, something I want to note, of course, a lot of these polls have very small sample sizes, and that's one of the reasons why I think they're very inaccurate. The polls with the larger sample sizes seem to get the race a lot more on the mark than some of these smaller sample size polls. But nonetheless, the average overall would have been terrible for Ron Johnson, and many people would have written him off as dead on arrival in 2016. And ultimately, that was not the case. Ron Johnson ended up overperforming Trump by 3 points or so. And he did extremely well in the wow counties compared to Donald Trump, overperforming him in some cases by over 10 percentage points. So Ron Johnson really is, in my opinion, a very strong electoral incumbent. Ron Johnson is somebody who always campaigns like he's 10 points down, and it seems ultimately that strategy works for him. Now, Russ Feingold was the incumbent that he unseated back in 2010. Russ Feingold decided to run for his old seat again. He actually did slightly worse than he did in 2010. But going back, Russ Feingold had pretty strong performances overall. In 1992, he beat a Republican incumbent by about 6.5 points. Of course, 1998 is a closer race. And then, of course, in 2004, he wipes the floor with Tim Michels, who is now running against Tony Evers in the governor's race. So ultimately, Russ Feingold was seen as a really strong incumbent, and yet Ron Johnson was able to beat him handedly in both 2010 and 2016, and I think that's a testament to his electoral strength. And ultimately, I think Mandela Barnes is a weaker candidate than Russ Feingold. Russ Feingold was an incumbent. He was even sort of a progressive Democrat, which, historically Wisconsin has tended to like. And Ron Johnson wasn't exactly a liberal Republican either. He was a generic and even conservative Republican, especially now. I think he's even moved more to the right since where he was back in 2010. And yet he's still extremely competitive in the polls, despite the fact that the polls oversample Democrats. So that is a good sign for Republicans overall. I think the polls throughout the 2022 cycle have massively underestimated Republicans. I mean, they did so in 2020. They did so in 2016. I don't see why that would really be a trend that would cease happening. But nonetheless, I think Johnson is in a strong position. And again, the national environment, even if it is D+2, I think Ron Johnson would still end up winning, because at the end of the day, Wisconsin is a very polarized state. It really runs right down the middle when you look at the margins. Again, both 2016 and 2020's margins of victory were under a point. So this is a state that has always been really close in recent years, and I think Ron Johnson will be the type of candidate that would be able to break through that and probably win by about 4 to 5 points, similar to his past performances in 2010 and 2016. And one of the ways I think he's able to do that is because of his strength in the wow counties, the suburban counties outside of Milwaukee. If we take a look at the 2020 trend maps, all of these counties trended towards the Democrats. Waukesha about 6 points, Washington 2 points, and of course Ozaukee nearly 7 points. Now, if we take a look back at 2016, Trump won these counties by pretty considerable margins, very safe margins, in some cases over 30 points, Washington nearly 40 points. And yet, if we take a look at 2020, there was a serious underperformance. And I think that was indicative of his weakness in these suburbs across the entire country, not just in the state of Wisconsin. But in Wisconsin, this area of the state is a huge vote basket for Republicans. Republicans need to run it up in these counties in order to win statewide. And historically, these counties were the reddest counties in the state. Looking back at 2008 and 2012, these counties were voting over 60% in favor of the Republican nominees, when really no other county in the rest of the state was doing that. In fact, a lot of the rural counties in 2008 went for Obama. The vast majority of them did. So that really goes to show you that the shift in Wisconsin is very real, especially in the rural parts of the state. The trend is really offset, of course, by the Milwaukee and, of course, Madison area, which I think keeps the Republicans from making the state the next Ohio or Iowa, where it's very much a likely red state, a state that Democrats really aren't realistically going to win anymore. But Wisconsin still isn't in that category, despite Milwaukee being a stagnant area. It is still trending more and more towards the left, and really the wow counties, I think, are going to be the key to Wisconsin's political future. But I think Ron Johnson's strength in these counties, I think, is a real testament to how electable he actually is, because these counties are very suburban. If he can win here and run up the margins here, he's certainly going to do a lot better across the entire state. And that's why I ultimately think Ron Johnson will win in November. And I think he'll beat Mandela Barnes by about 4 to 5 points. And that's why I've consistently had Wisconsin as a lean Republican state. This is a state that votes to the right of the nation. consistently now, both in 2016 and 2020. I expect that to continue, especially since the polls in Wisconsin seem to be better than the national polls overall. It's likely that we could even see a situation where Wisconsin's voting to the right of the nation again. And that, of course, would further cement Wisconsin's rightward drift, as it has been really going in that direction since 2008. So ultimately, Ron Johnson wins in Wisconsin. I really don't think there's a realistic chance at this time that the Democrat Mandela Barnes unseats him, especially since Ron Johnson is a strong incumbent. And even despite the fact that he really doesn't have very high favorables, he's still a widely known name. He basically has 100% name ID in the state of Wisconsin, and he's an incumbent Republican running in a year where Republicans are expected to do well. And ultimately, all of those things put together, I think he wins by certainly a lean margin, perhaps even more than that if these trends continue. But I think, his unfavorables will kind of keep him at a 4 to 5 point margin of victory in Wisconsin. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please like this video down below if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.